Welcome this evening to our first meeting of the evening. Has to do with our education development charges and policy review. So at this time, I'm going to call the meeting to order and ask our tech to play our land acknowledgements.
The land upon which we work, live, and sustain ourselves is the ancestral and treaty lands of the Michizagig Anishinaabe, also known today as the Mississaugas of the Credit, the rightful caretakers and title holders of this land. We also recognize the rich pre-contact history and relationships which include the Anishinaabe and the Ongwe-Hongwe.
Since European contact, this land continues to be home to Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. As responsible community members, we value the diversity, dignity, and worth of all people.
Colonialism displaced and dispossessed Indigenous peoples of their ancestral land
and continues to deny their basic human rights, dignities, and freedoms.
We are committed to learning true history to reconcile, make reparations, and fulfill our treaty obligations to the original peoples and our collective responsibilities to the lands, water, animals, and each other for future generations.
Thank you. So, trustees, you have the agenda before you this afternoon, and there's no addition to the agenda. So I'm going to ask Trustee Cameron if you'd move approval, seconded by Trustee Jill Pomelli. All those in favor? Carries. Thank you. And we're going to move down to item 4, which is conflict of interest. I'm looking around the room. I'm not seeing any, so I'm moving down. And we're going to move down to item 5, which is a report from official and staff. 5.1 is our education development charges policy review. And before staff say anything, I just want to take a minute to go over a few things here this afternoon. The board is proposing to enact a successor education development charges bylaw. And as part of this process is conducting a review of the education development charges policy. The board is seeking input from the public and will give consideration to the submission received prior to passing an education development charge bylaw. The Education Act, which is the legislation that governs the EDC, require that the board convene a 2 public meetings before passing the new bylaw. The board will be conducting both public meetings this evening. The first public meeting will be dealt with a review of the current EDC policy of the board as reflected in its current bylaw. This is a formal public meeting required by Section 257.60 of the Education Act. The second public meeting will address the proposed bylaw that the board anticipates passing next month. We intend to give final consideration to the passage of EDC bylaw on May 22nd, 2024. The board welcome your input tonight as well as any input you might care to give later, either in writing or orally. Now, I will ask Associate Director Jaspal Gill tonight to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Chair Green. The primary purpose of any school board in implementing education development charges is to provide a source of funding for new school sites. These are not funded by a per pupil grant under the province's funding formula. The EDC calculation is generally based on new pupils generated by housing units within the bylaw area, in our case, the region of Peel, for which building permits will be issued over the next 15-year period, and for which additional school accommodation is required. The board has worked in close cooperation with Dufferin Peel Catholic District School Board in developing the proposed education development charges for each board. The boards coordinated their efforts in conducting the background analysis, respecting growth projections, pupil enrollment, forecast, determination of growth-related people-place requirements, site costing, and in completing their respective EDC forms through continuing discussions. The two boards have held 2 meetings with the EDC stakeholder representatives, representatives of the land development industry and municipalities on January 11th, 2024, and again on April 5th, 2024. I have now pleasure of introducing Jag Amendolia of Watson and Associates and Jim Easto, Solicitor, Keel Cottrell, LLP. Mr. Amendolia and Mr. Easto are here tonight to present at the first committee of the whole board our education development charges policy review. And at the second meeting, they will present the board's education development charges background study and proposed new bylaw. Mr. Chair, this will be the board's 7th education development charge bylaw. It was first passed in 1996. Board approval of the renewal EDC bylaw will be recommended at the regular meeting of the board, May 22nd, 2024. Mr. Amendolia will now present the policy review.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to the director, Mr. Chair, trustees for having me speak to everyone tonight. As was mentioned, we're really doing 2 meetings within 1 meeting tonight, and the first meeting is going to focus on the existing EDC policies of the existing EDC bylaw. So if I could move over a couple of slides. Thank you. One more. Great. So really starting at the beginning before we get into the policies, important to for a bit of a reminder and a refresh, just so everyone is clear about what an education development charge is and what we're going to be speaking about tonight. So it's a charge that is imposed under a bylaw respecting growth-related net education land costs that are incurred or proposed to be incurred by a school board. So in simpler terms, what this means is that it's a charge that's levied on any new residential or non-residential development. The charge is paid by the developer or permit taker when the building permit is issued by the municipality. The municipality collects those funds on behalf of the school boards, then transfers those school funds to the school board. The premise is that the school board then uses those funds to purchase any school sites or develop those school sites that are a result of any new residential growth in the jurisdiction. So that's in a nutshell what we're talking about when we talk about education development charges. The next couple of minutes, and related, if we move to the next slide, the next couple of minutes and related to this particular presentation, I mentioned that we're going to talk about the EDC policies of the existing bylaw. One thing that should be clear to trustees as well as the public is that when we speak about EDC policies, they're contained or specific to the EDC bylaw. So they're a little bit different from a typical school board policy if we think about a boundary policy or a transportation policy. These are only with relation to the actual EDC bylaw. And the reason that we have this EDC policy review meeting is because the legislation says that the school board must do certain things before they can consider a new EDC bylaw. And one of those things is reviewing the existing policies and conducting a meeting to discuss those policies, and the relevant legislative reference is on the screen now. So we're going to spend the next couple of minutes, if we move to the next slide, talking about some of the main EDC policies. And one really important thing I also think to take from this is it doesn't necessarily impact the charge. And what I mean by that is how I calculate the charge. But really, when we think about EDC policies, it's more about how the charge is allocated and how the charge is collected. So the next couple of policies we're going to talk about are things to like where the bylaw applies, differentiated charges versus uniform charges, residential, non-residential allocation as well. So next slide, please. So the first one I want to speak about actually has to do with how much of your costs are actually, your growth-related costs are actually borne through EDCs. So for the trustees and the public's benefit, the way that the consultant, myself, calculates the charge is based on 100% cost recovery. So all the acquisition and all the site preparation costs that you need, I calculate it to assume that you're going to collect 100% of that through education development charges. But there are exemptions in the EDC legislation. Those exemptions that are in the legislation, so a statutory exemption, is something that I calculate. So there is no revenue loss to the school board. And your legal counsel is on tonight and could talk about some of those more specifically. But the important part is they are legislative, non-voluntary exemptions, no revenue loss. I calculate for them. However, most bylaws in the province also contains some form of a voluntary exemption. The legislation doesn't say you have to do it, but some boards elect to do that. What's important, again, for trustees to recognize is that any voluntary exemption is a revenue loss. And I try to give school boards a really simple example and say, you have every authority to exempt, every new house that has a red door. Nothing stops you from doing that. But all the money that we had expected to come from houses with red doors, that would be a revenue loss that the board would have to come up with. And the reason we talk about this is many times when we go out to our stakeholders, and that's not only development communities, but municipal partners as well, they would like to see consistency in the education development charge bylaw with their municipal development charge bylaw. And that has to do sometimes with exemptions. But the reason we bring this up and what we explain to them is, as much as we would like the bylaws to be as consistent as possible, there has to be recognition that in areas where the board may incur revenue loss, they have limited sources to make up for that revenue, where a municipality can always draw on other sources like the tax base. So that's what I want everyone to be clear about when we talk about exemptions and how much of the charge we try to collect through EDCs. If we move to the next slide, the next couple of main policies we want to discuss, the first one is jurisdiction-wide versus an area-specific or municipal type charge. So again, the legislation allows the school board to decide whether they want an education development charge to be applied in a uniform way across your entire jurisdiction. So whether you're in Caledon or Brampton or Mississauga, you pay the exact same charge. That's how your charge is applied right now. And that's how the vast majority, and I mean the significant majority, are applied across the province. There are limited examples of area-specific charges, but where those examples exist, it's typically only a board that has a sole growth area. The EDC applies to that area, but not other areas of the jurisdiction. Like I said, the majority of the bylaws are applied in a uniform way, exactly the same as yours bylaw is. The next major policy is allocation between residential and non-residential development. So again, the legislation permits a school board to decide to charge anywhere from 0% of their EDC to non-residential, all the way up to 40%. The average around the province is around 10%, and that's just been, again, negotiated with stakeholders over the several years or decades, I guess, in your case, of EDC bylaws. And 10% has been that average around the province. And again, that's where your bylaw lies as well, is in that 10% range. So those are the two main policies, jurisdiction-wide versus area municipal, and residential, non-residential. If we move to the next slide. Thank you. The last policy, main policy I want to speak about is uniform charges for all types of development versus a differentiated charge. So what we're speaking about here is if you think about residential development, singles, semis, low-density family houses, townhouses, condos, those are all the main types of residential development that occur in the region. So way back when EDC started, the boards only had an ability to charge an EDC in a uniform way, which means regardless of what type of development you were building, low, medium, or high, you paid a uniform rate, the same charge. In 2002, there was a change made to the legislation that again permitted boards to decide whether they wanted the charge to be applied uniformly or on a differentiated basis. Since 2002, no board has elected to go with a differentiated EDC. They have all been uniform. Yours is uniform as well. And I'll just add a little bit of information there. This is like most of the policies that we're talking about tonight. This is the type of information we go out to the public and we go out to the stakeholders with. And we say, this is the way that we've applied these policies. Is there any desire or wishes to see these policies applied differently? And to date, we haven't received much feedback with regard to the policies. And typically, the methodology would be to recommend status quo. So that's what I'm explaining tonight, is that we haven't received much feedback with regard to these specific policies, but your board staff will prepare a report that will outline their recommendations with regard to these policies before passage consideration. The last thing I'll mention just on these policies, especially with the one that we're looking at on the screen now, we're starting to hear more from the development community over the last several years with regard to a differentiated rate. However, and we'll talk about this in the next presentation in a little bit more detail, because charges are capped and phased in, there are some limits to policy changes, and a differentiated charge has some limitations to it because of that cap. So maybe I'll stop there and pass things over back to the chair.
Thank you, sir, for that presentation that you have made. At this time, I don't see any public in the gallery, and I'm looking online. Catherine, can you confirm? I haven't seen any public. If we did have public tonight, we would invite for anyone who had anything to address or to speak with us about this. But again, we don't see any. At this time, do any trustee have any question in terms of what you heard tonight? Seeing none? Trustee Cameron, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the information. I had a question about our board. Do we create any voluntary exemptions in our policies?
I can answer that through you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, it's Jimmy Stowe. My camera's not working, which is probably most of the people who know me will be just as happy. You do. For example, you exempt public hospitals. I think that's pretty much the only, you exempt public hospitals, and you also exempt non-residential farm buildings. Those are the two exemptions, as far as I'm aware, that you have chosen to give that you do not have to give.
Okay, thank you. The question, I think, would be obviously born out of loss of money if we're based on the description we just had of what voluntary exemption was. So I'm pleased to hear that we're helping, but not where we shouldn't be. Thank you.
Thank you.
Trustee Clark, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Through you, Chair. Thanks for the information. My question, it may seem a little random. Is there a way to change the, alternate the EDC rates to encourage housing? Or, yeah.
Jim, you want to take that?
I'm not, that's a great question. I don't think so. You're getting Jack and me to talk to each other sort of online, and that's fine. If you wanted to encourage housing, well, first of all, your EDC is small potatoes,
yeah,
compared to municipal DCs. So I'm not sure how much sway you have to start with.
Yeah.
Second, if you decide to cut your charge in half, then you've lost. Then I don't know where you're already losing revenue because of the cap. So I don't think there is much sway for that. That's my legal opinion in any sort of which opinion. That's on that question.
Yeah, through you, Chair. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, that's pretty much what I was thinking, but thank you.
Okay, great.
Thank you for that, Jing. And
yeah, if I may, through you, Mr. Chair, the only thing I would just add to that is that in essence, because of what Mr. Easto just mentioned, there is a phase-in for any of the charge that goes up over $300 or 10 cents on the non-res side. So in a way, the government with that legislative change has already reacted to limiting how high the EDC charge can be.
Thank you for that, Jack. Appreciate that. Okay, Trustee Davy.
Through you, Chair. If it is agreed that the trend seems to be to multi-unit housing, as in condos and stuff like that, would it not be in our best interest to just leave it where it is, because we are getting per unit? And that's sort of, and I'm all for getting as much money as we can for the students' appeal.
Did you hear that, Jack? You can speak to that.
Yeah, I can answer that. Again, through you, Mr. Chair. As your economic consultant, I would say yes, a uniform rate makes more financial sense. Again, because of what Mr. Easto mentioned, due to the cap and the ability of the board not to already collect at its proposed maximum rate. We'll get into that in the next meeting. Any differentiation of the charge would likely result in a reduction of a further reduction in what you're able to collect. So yes, I would agree with, for my financial component, yes, I would agree with what the trustee said.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. I'm looking around. I don't see any other question. Okay, so I want to take the time to say thank you to both of you this evening for being here, and great to have you walk us through and then answer these questions. Thank you. I'm going to move to Trustee Davy. Trustee McDonald. All right, all those in favor? Carries. Thank you. All right.
Do you have to wait until 6 o'clock to start the next meeting?
Yeah. Okay, so we have no communication for action this afternoon, and Trustee Cameron and Trustee Sapal Singh is moving adjournment. Okay, all right, thank you.